The humidity was unbearable. 98 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. Private First Class David Hendricks wiped the sweat from his forehead with a sleeve already soaked through, his M16 rifle feeling heavier with every step through the dense jungle of the Ia Drang Valley. It was November 1965, and the 19-year-old from Milwaukee had been in Vietnam for exactly 47 days. He had heard stories from his father, a man who had stormed the beaches of Normandy 21 years earlier. Stories of German artillery, of the relentless pounding that turned sand into glass and men into memories. His father had survived that hell, had come home with a purple heart and nightmares that never fully faded. Now, halfway around the world, in a war that seemed nothing like the one his father had described, David was about to discover that some weapons never truly retire. The first sound was distant, a low rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The experienced sergeant at the front of the patrol held up his fist, and 12 men froze in place. The jungle had gone silent. No birds, no insects, just that steady, mechanical heartbeat growing louder. Then the sky opened up. The Huey gunships came in low and fast, their door gunners already firing before David could process what was happening. But these weren't the sleek, modern helicopters he had trained with back at Fort Benning. Mounted on their sides were weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum, in black and white photographs from another era. The distinctive sound was unmistakable to anyone who had studied military history. The M2 Browning, 50 caliber machine gun, a weapon designed in 1918, refined throughout the 1930s, and battle-tested across every theater of the Second World War, was once again speaking its terrible language. The tree line erupted. Bark, leaves, and things David refused to identify sprayed in every direction as the heavy rounds tore through the jungle with devastating efficiency. The Viet Cong position that had been preparing to ambush his patrol simply ceased to exist. Where there had been enemy soldiers, there was now only destruction. David pressed himself into the earth, his heart pounding against the muddy ground, and in that moment he understood something his father had never been able to put into words. War doesn't change. It just changes addresses. The M2 Browning was not supposed to be here. This was supposed to be a new kind of war. Fought with new weapons, new tactics, new technology. The military-industrial complex had promised Congress and the American people that Vietnam would showcase the future of warfare. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, electronic surveillance systems that could detect enemy movement from miles away. And yet, when the bullets started flying, when American lives hung in the balance, the military reached back into its arsenal and pulled out the same tools that had defeated Hitler's Germany and Tojo's Japan. It was a decision born not of nostalgia, but of brutal pragmatism. The weapons of the Second World War had been designed to kill efficiently, and 2 decades of peacetime had done nothing to diminish that capability. In many cases, the technology that was supposed to replace them had proven unreliable, complicated, or simply inferior to designs that had been perfected through years of total war. The story of how these weapons came to dominate the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia is a story of institutional memory, battlefield necessity, and the uncomfortable truth that progress is not always linear. It is a story that begins not in Vietnam, but in the factories and battlefields of a previous generation, where American industry and American blood combined to create instruments of death so effective that they would still be claiming lives decades after their intended war had ended. John Moses Browning never saw the weapon that would bear his name become legendary. The genius firearms designer died in 1926, just 8 years after completing the initial design for what would become the M2 heavy machine gun. He had created it in response to a specific request from General John Pershing, who had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of German heavy machine guns during the First World War and demanded that American forces have something comparable. What Browning delivered exceeded all expectations. The M2 was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, capable of firing 550 rounds per minute at an effective range of nearly 2,000 yards. Its 50 caliber rounds could penetrate light armor, disable vehicles, and destroy aircraft. It was accurate, reliable, and simple enough to be maintained by soldiers with minimal training. By the time the Second World War began, the M2 had become standard equipment on virtually every American vehicle, aircraft, and naval vessel. During the war, the M2 earned a reputation that bordered on mythical. Tank commanders swore by it for engaging enemy infantry. Anti-aircraft crews credited it with downing hundreds of Japanese and German planes. Infantry units pleaded for more of them, knowing that a single M2 could provide the kind of suppressive fire that would take a dozen riflemen to match. But when the war ended, the M2 was supposed to fade into history. New weapons were being developed. New calibers were being tested. The future, military planners assured Congress, lay in lighter, faster-firing weapons that could be carried by individual soldiers rather than mounted on vehicles and tripods. They were wrong. In Vietnam, the M2 found new life in a role that John Moses Browning could never have imagined. Mounted on helicopters, it became the primary defensive weapon for the air cavalry units that would come to define American strategy in Southeast Asia. The UH-1 Iroquois, better known as the Huey, became the iconic image of the Vietnam War, and the M2 mounted in its doorway became the sound that defined countless engagements. The reasons were simple. The jungle environment was brutal on equipment. The humidity corroded sensitive electronics. The mud jammed intricate mechanisms. The heat warped precision components. But the M2, designed in an era before such complications, simply kept working. Its tolerances were generous. Its moving parts were few. Its ammunition was plentiful and standardized. When a door gunner needed a weapon that would fire every single time he pulled the trigger, regardless of conditions, the M2 delivered. There was also the matter of stopping power. The enemy in Vietnam was not fighting from tanks or armored vehicles. They were fighting from tunnels, from tree lines, from fortified positions built from bamboo and earth. These positions could withstand the lighter rounds of newer weapons, but the 50 caliber rounds of the M2 tore through them like paper. A single well-placed burst could collapse a bunker. A sustained barrage could render an entire defensive line untenable. Private David Hendricks learned these lessons not from training manuals or classroom instruction, but from watching that M2 save his life in the Ia Drang Valley. As the Hueys circled overhead, their door gunners systematically dismantling the Viet Cong ambush, he understood that survival in this war would depend not on the latest technology, but on the proven effectiveness of weapons that had already won one world war. He would spend the next 11 months in Vietnam, and in that time he would see the M2 deployed in ways that would have seemed impossible to its designer. He would see them mounted on river patrol boats, sweeping the banks of the Mekong Delta. He would see them installed on fixed defensive positions around firebase perimeters. He would see them carried by special operations teams deep into enemy territory, their crews willing to accept the weight penalty in exchange for the firepower advantage. And he would learn that the M2 was just the beginning. The military had reached back into its arsenal for other weapons as well, other designs from that earlier conflict that had proven too effective to retire. The war in Vietnam was supposed to be a showcase for modern American military technology. Instead, it became a museum of the Second World War, a living demonstration that some weapons are simply too good to replace. The jungle had taught the military a lesson that peacetime planners had forgotten. Complexity fails. Simplicity survives. And when American lives are on the line, the weapons that have already proven themselves in combat will always be preferred over the weapons that have only proven themselves in testing. David Hendricks survived his tour in Vietnam. He came home to Milwaukee in the fall of 1966, carrying with him memories that would take decades to process. But he never forgot the sound of that M2 in the Ia Drang Valley, never forgot the way it had reached across 20 years of history to save his life. His father had heard that same sound on the beaches of Normandy. Now he had heard it in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Some weapons, he realized, are not bound by time. They are bound only by their effectiveness. And in that regard, the M2 Browning was eternal. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week we uncover the hidden stories of military history that changed the world, and the only way to make sure you never miss one is to subscribe right now. Staff Sergeant Raymond Torres had seen the B-52 Stratofortress on countless occasions during his 18 months in Vietnam. The massive bomber, with its swept wings and distinctive fuselage, was a regular sight in the skies above Southeast Asia. But he had never truly understood its power until the night of June 18, 1965, when he watched it demonstrate capabilities that had been developed to destroy Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The target was a suspected Viet Cong staging area in Binh Duong province, roughly 30 miles north of Saigon. Intelligence suggested that enemy forces were massing for a major offensive, gathering supplies and reinforcements in a densely forested region that conventional ground forces could not reach without sustaining catastrophic casualties. The decision was made to employ strategic bombing, and the weapon chosen for the task was one that had been designed 2 decades earlier to carry nuclear weapons to Soviet cities. Torres was stationed at a firebase approximately 12 miles from the target area. Close enough to feel the results. Close enough to understand why the men who flew these missions called them Arc Light, a code name that suggested illumination but delivered annihilation. The first indication that something was happening was a low rumble, almost subsonic, that Torres felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. The ground beneath his feet began to vibrate. The water in his canteen trembled. And then, from somewhere high above the clouds, invisible and untouchable, the B-52s released their payload. What followed was not a bombing in any conventional sense. It was a geological event. The Earth itself seemed to convulse as 500-pound bombs detonated in rapid succession across the target area. The sound arrived not as discrete explosions, but as a continuous roar, a thunderstorm compressed into 30 seconds of absolute destruction. The sky flickered orange through the clouds. Trees that had stood for a century were reduced to splinters. Bunkers that had taken months to construct were erased as if they had never existed. Torres watched in stunned silence as the jungle 12 miles away simply disappeared beneath a wall of fire and smoke that rose thousands of feet into the night sky. He had trained with artillery. He had called in airstrikes from F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs. He had seen the destructive power of modern military aviation up close. But nothing had prepared him for arc light. Nothing could have. The B-52 had been designed in the aftermath of the Second World War, when American military planners were grappling with the implications of nuclear weapons and the need to deliver them over intercontinental distances. The design requirements were simple in concept and staggering in execution. The aircraft needed to fly higher than any fighter could intercept, farther than any previous bomber could reach, and carry a payload large enough to devastate a city. Boeing delivered exactly that. The B-52 entered service in 1955 with a combat radius of over 4,000 miles and a service ceiling of 50,000 feet. It could carry up to 70,000 pounds of ordnance, a capability that had been designed with nuclear weapons in mind, but proved equally devastating with conventional bombs. Its 8 jet engines could keep it airborne for over 16 hours without refueling, allowing it to strike targets anywhere on Earth with minimal warning. For the first decade of its service, the B-52 had been exclusively a nuclear delivery platform. Its crews trained for missions they hoped they would never fly, practicing approaches to Soviet targets that would have ended civilization as they knew it. The aircraft spent countless hours airborne on Chrome Dome patrols, circling the Arctic with live nuclear weapons, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Vietnam changed everything. The decision to use B-52s for conventional bombing was controversial from the beginning. The aircraft had not been designed for such missions. Its crews had not trained for them. The entire doctrine of strategic air command was built around nuclear deterrence, not jungle warfare. But the situation on the ground demanded a response that tactical aircraft could not provide, and the B-52 was the only platform capable of delivering it. The first Arc Light mission flew on June 18, 1965, the same night that Torres watched from his firebase as the jungle burned. 27 B-52Fs from the 7th and 320th Bomb Wings took off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and flew over 3,000 miles to strike targets in South Vietnam. Each aircraft carried up to 27 750-pound bombs or 51 500-pound bombs, depending on the mission profile. The total payload for that first mission exceeded 700 tons of high explosives. The results were immediate and devastating. Post-strike reconnaissance revealed that the target area had been completely destroyed. Trees had been knocked down in concentric circles extending hundreds of yards from each impact point. Craters had been gouged into the earth that would still be visible decades later, and the enemy forces that had been massing for an offensive simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit. For Torres and the thousands of American soldiers who witnessed Arc Light missions over the following years, the experience was transformative. These were men who had grown up with stories of the Second World War, of the massive bombing campaigns that had reduced German and Japanese cities to rubble. They had seen the photographs, read the histories, perhaps even met veterans who had flown those missions. But nothing in those stories had conveyed the visceral reality of what strategic bombing actually meant. The ground shook. The air itself seemed to compress. And in the distance, an area the size of a small town simply disappeared beneath a curtain of fire and steel. It was power on a scale that seemed almost impossible, and yet it was being delivered by aircraft that had been built to fight a different enemy in a different era. The B-52 would fly over 126,000 missions during the Vietnam War, dropping over 2.6 million tons of ordnance on targets throughout Southeast Asia. That figure is difficult to comprehend in the abstract, so consider it this way. The total tonnage dropped by American aircraft during the entire Second World War was approximately 1 million tons. Vietnam exceeded that total with B-52s alone. The tactical implications were profound. The enemy quickly learned to fear the sound of B-52 engines, even though those engines flew too high to be heard. They learned to disperse their forces, to avoid concentrations that might attract arc-light attention. They learned to build deeper bunkers, to move only at night, to never remain in one location for more than a few hours. But they could not escape. The B-52 did not need to see its targets. It did not need to brave anti-aircraft fire or dodge surface-to-air missiles. It simply flew above it all, at altitudes where nothing could touch it, and rained destruction on coordinates provided by intelligence analysts thousands of miles away. The enemy could hide, they could disperse, they could dig deeper. But when the coordinates were accurate, nothing survived. The psychological impact was equally significant. Prisoners captured after arc-light strikes often described the experience in terms that bordered on the metaphysical. They spoke of the ground itself becoming their enemy, of being trapped in a world where the very concept of shelter had become meaningless. Some simply surrendered rather than face another strike, their will to fight broken not by enemy soldiers, but by the impersonal terror of bombs falling from aircraft they could not see. Torres completed his tour in Vietnam in 1967 and returned to a country that was increasingly divided over the war. He would later describe the arc-light missions as the most powerful thing he had ever witnessed, more powerful than hurricanes or earthquakes, more powerful than anything he had imagined possible. The B-52, designed to deliver nuclear destruction to Soviet cities, had found a new purpose in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and in doing so, it had demonstrated that the weapons of the Second World War were not relics of a forgotten age. They were the foundation upon which modern American military power was built. The Stratofortress would continue flying combat missions for another 50 years, its airframe updated and upgraded, but its fundamental design unchanged from the aircraft that had first taken flight in 1952. It would drop bombs on Iraq, on Afghanistan, on targets throughout the Middle East and Central Asia, and every time it did, it carried with it the legacy of those first arc-light missions over Vietnam, when the hammer from heaven proved that some weapons are simply too powerful to retire. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the Song Dong Nai River when Petty Officer Second Class Michael Chen first heard the distinctive sound that would define the next 3 hours of his life. He was standing on the bow of PBR 721, a Mark II patrol boat running the routine morning sweep of a river section approximately 40 miles northeast of Saigon. The date was April 15, 1968, 2 months after the Tet Offensive had shattered any remaining illusions about the trajectory of the war. Chen had been in country for 7 months, long enough to develop the instincts that kept river sailors alive, but not long enough to become complacent. The brown waters of the Mekong Delta and its tributaries were among the most dangerous operating environments in Vietnam. The enemy controlled the banks. They controlled the vegetation that grew thick and impenetrable along the shoreline. They controlled the villages where farmers who smiled at American boats by day guided Viet Cong sappers by night. And they controlled the ambush points, the narrow channels where patrol boats had no room to maneuver and where concentrated fire from concealed positions could transform a routine patrol into a catastrophe. The sound that Chen heard was the opening burst of an RPD light machine gun, a Soviet-designed weapon that the Viet Cong had received in enormous quantities through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The round stitched across the water approximately 20 yards ahead of PBR-721, the gunner walking his fire toward the American boat with practiced precision. Within seconds, the entire northern bank of the river erupted with muzzle flashes as the ambush was sprung. What happened next was a demonstration of why certain weapons earn the trust of those who depend on them for survival. The twin 50 caliber M2 machine guns mounted on PBR-721's bow and stern positions returned fire immediately, their heavy rounds tearing into the tree line with devastating effect. But it was the weapon in the center of the boat that would prove decisive, a weapon that had been designed before Michael Chen's father was born. The Mark 19 grenade launcher had not yet been deployed to Vietnam in significant numbers. The minigun, while effective, consumed ammunition at rates that made sustained firefights problematic. But the M19-119A4 30 caliber machine gun, John Moses Browning's other masterpiece, was aboard PBR-721 and every other patrol boat in the Mekong Delta, and in the hands of gunner's mate 3rd Class William Patterson, it was about to earn its nickname once again. Old Faithful, the crews called it. The gun that never jammed. The gun that never quit. The gun that had chewed through German positions in Normandy, suppressed Japanese bunkers across the Pacific, and now found itself in the brown waters of Vietnam, doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Patterson squeezed the trigger and held it. The M1919 responded with a steady, rhythmic hammering that seemed almost leisurely compared to the frantic chattering of the lighter weapons on both sides. But that steady rhythm was deceptive. The M1919 fired between 400 and 600 rounds per minute, each 30.06 round capable of penetrating light cover and continuing through whatever was behind it. Patterson swept the tree line in controlled bursts, not trying to hit specific targets but trying to make the entire concealment untenable. The theory was simple. The Viet Cong were using the vegetation as cover, firing from positions they believed were invisible to American gunners. The M1919 didn't need to see them. It simply needed to destroy everything they might be hiding behind. Trees that had provided concealment became deadly hazards as heavy rounds shattered branches and sent splinters flying at lethal velocities. The mud berms that protected firing positions were churned into useless slurry. The bamboo screens that had hidden machine gun nests were reduced to shredded ribbons. For 3 hours, PBR-721 fought its way up the Songdong Nai, breaking through ambush after ambush as the crew cycled through ammunition belts with desperate efficiency. Chen lost count of how many times he heard Patterson's M1919 fall silent as a belt ran dry, only to resume its hammering seconds later as a fresh belt was loaded. The gun never failed. Not once in 3 hours of continuous combat did it jam, overheat, or malfunction in any way. The M1919 had been designed in 1919, the year that gave it its designation, as a lighter alternative to the M1917 heavy machine gun that Browning had created for the First World War. The Army wanted a weapon that could be carried by infantry rather than mounted on vehicles, something that could provide the suppressive fire of a heavy machine gun without the logistical burden of a water-cooled system. Browning's solution was elegant. He air-cooled the weapon by adding a perforated barrel jacket that allowed ambient air to circulate around the barrel. He reduced the weight by using lighter materials and a more compact receiver. And he chambered it in 30.06, the same round used by the M1 Garand rifle, simplifying ammunition logistics. The result was a weapon that weighed just over 30 pounds with tripod, compared to nearly 100 pounds for the water-cooled M1917. It could be carried by a 2-man crew, set up in seconds, and provide sustained fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. It was not as accurate as the heavier gun, and it could not sustain fire indefinitely without barrel changes. But for mobile infantry operations, it was a revelation. During the Second World War, the M1919 was everywhere. It was mounted on jeeps and half-tracks. It was carried by infantry squads advancing through the hedgerows of Normandy. It was installed on B-17 bombers and B-24 Liberators, serving as waist guns and tail guns that defended against enemy fighters. It was aboard every landing craft that hit every beach from Anzio to Iwo Jima. An estimated 400,000 M1919s were produced during the war, making it one of the most widely manufactured machine guns in American history. And when Vietnam began to escalate, it was there once again, proving that some designs are simply too good to replace. For Michael Chen, the M1919 was not a historical artifact. It was the reason he survived April 15, 1968. When PBR 721 finally cleared the ambush zone and reached friendly waters, the crew conducted a damage assessment that revealed just how close they had come to disaster. The boat had taken over 40 hits, 2 crewmen were wounded, the radio was destroyed. But the M1919 had fired over 3,000 rounds without a single malfunction. Patterson sat beside his weapon as the adrenaline faded, his hands still trembling from 3 hours of continuous combat. The barrel of the M1919 was discolored from heat, the paint on the receiver blistered and peeling. But when he cycled the action, it moved with the same smooth precision it had shown at the beginning of the engagement. Old Faithful had earned its name once again. The M1919 would continue serving in Vietnam until the end of American involvement, and its variants would remain in service with Allied nations for decades afterward. It was eventually replaced by the M60 machine gun, a newer design that offered some advantages in weight and portability. But veterans who had used both weapons often expressed a preference for the older gun, citing its reliability and the confidence it inspired. Chen returned home in 1969 and never forgot the lessons he learned on the Songdong Nai. War, he understood, was not about technology, it was about trust. And the weapons that earned that trust were the ones that worked when everything else failed. If this story is touching your heart, leave a comment right now saying, "Old weapons, eternal lessons." I want to know who understands that true effectiveness has no expiration date. The A-1 Skyraider was an anachronism the moment it arrived in Vietnam. By 1964, the age of propeller-driven combat aircraft was supposed to be over. Jet fighters ruled the skies. Supersonic speeds were standard. The piston engine, that mechanical marvel that had powered aviation from the Wright brothers through the Second World War, had been relegated to civilian aircraft and training squadrons. And yet, there it was. A single-engine, propeller-driven attack aircraft designed in 1945, flying combat missions alongside F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs that could fly 3 times its speed. To observers unfamiliar with the realities of air warfare, it seemed absurd. To the pilots who flew it and the soldiers who depended on it, the Skyraider was the most valuable aircraft in Southeast Asia. Lieutenant Commander James "Sandy" Morrison understood why. He had flown jets. He had experienced the raw power of afterburners and the exhilaration of breaking the sound barrier. But when American lives were on the line, when a downed pilot was surrounded by enemy forces and needed immediate close air support, Morrison wanted to be in a Skyraider. The reasons were counterintuitive but compelling. The Skyraider was slow, and that slowness was its greatest advantage. Jet aircraft screamed over the battlefield at speeds that made accurate weapons delivery extraordinarily difficult. They had seconds to identify targets, align their approach, and release ordnance before overshooting the engagement area. The Skyraider, cruising at a leisurely 200 knots, could loiter over a battlefield for hours, precisely placing bombs and rockets on targets that jets could barely see. Its payload capacity was equally remarkable. The Skyraider could carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance on 15 external hardpoints, more than many larger aircraft. That payload could include bombs, rockets, napalm canisters, gun pods, and specialized munitions that no other aircraft could deliver with such precision. A single Skyraider could remain on station for 6 hours, methodically destroying enemy positions while jets burned through their fuel in minutes. Morrison flew his first rescue support mission on March 10, 1966. An F-105 pilot had been shot down over North Vietnam, and enemy forces were closing on his position. 2 Skyraiders, callsign Sandy-01 and Sandy-02, were scrambled to provide cover while rescue helicopters moved into position. What followed was a masterclass in close air support. Morrison and his wingman circled the downed pilot's position at treetop level, their Skyraiders absorbing ground fire that would have destroyed more fragile aircraft. The Wright R-3350 engine, the same power plant that had carried B-29s over Tokyo, proved remarkably resistant to small arms fire. Its 18 cylinders provided redundancy that jet engines could not match. Lose a few cylinders, and the Skyraider kept flying. Lose a turbine blade, and a jet became a glider. For 4 hours, the two Sky Raiders held off enemy forces, making repeated strafing runs with their 420mm cannons and dropping ordnance on any position that threatened the rescue operation. They took hits. They took more hits. Morrison counted 17 holes in his aircraft when he finally landed, but the Sky Raider had never wavered. The F-105 pilot was rescued. He would later credit the Sky Raider crews with saving his life, describing their performance as the most impressive display of airmanship he had ever witnessed. Morrison received a Silver Star for the mission, but he always insisted that the credit belonged to the aircraft itself. The Sky Raider had been designed by Ed Heinemann of Douglas Aircraft in the closing months of the Second World War. The Navy had requested a single-seat torpedo bomber to replace the aging TBF Avenger, and Heinemann delivered a design that exceeded every specification. The XBT-2D1 prototype first flew on March 18, 1945, just months before the war ended. The timing was unfortunate. By the time the Sky Raider entered production, the Navy was already transitioning to jet aircraft. The conventional wisdom held that propeller-driven combat aircraft were obsolete, relics of a war that was already fading into history. The Sky Raider was produced in limited numbers and assigned to attack squadrons that many considered second-tier. Korea changed that perception. The Sky Raider proved devastating in the close air support role, delivering ordnance with accuracy that jets could not match. Its ability to loiter over the battlefield for extended periods made it invaluable for troops in contact with enemy forces. Pilots who had initially resented their assignment to propeller aircraft came to appreciate the Sky Raider's unique capabilities. But even Korea did not fully reveal what the Sky Raider could do. That revelation would come in Vietnam, where the aircraft found its ultimate purpose. The search and rescue mission became the Sky Raider's signature role. When American aircraft went down over hostile territory, the Sky Raiders were the first responders. They would locate the downed crew, establish communication, suppress enemy forces, and protect the rescue helicopters that moved in for extraction. The missions were extraordinarily dangerous, requiring pilots to fly low and slow over heavily defended areas while absorbing whatever fire the enemy could direct at them. The Sky Raider excelled at this role because it could do things that jets simply could not. It could fly slowly enough to maintain visual contact with personnel on the ground. It could carry enough ordnance to sustain a firefight for hours rather than minutes. It could absorb damage that would have destroyed more sophisticated aircraft. And its pilots developed a reputation for aggressiveness and skill that made them legendary among the rescue helicopter crews they protected. Morrison flew 287 combat missions in the Sky Raider before completing his tour in 1967. He was shot down once, rescued by the same helicopter crews he had protected on countless previous missions, and returned to flying within 2 weeks. The aircraft that had been designed to fight the Japanese in 1945 had become his defining experience as a combat pilot, a weapon from another era that had proven itself irreplaceable in modern warfare. The Sky Raider was finally retired from American service in 1972, replaced by the jet-powered A-7 Corsair II. But its legacy endured in the tactics and doctrine of close air support, in the rescue procedures that would save countless lives in future conflicts, and in the memories of the men who had flown it. Some weapons are defined by their technology. Others are defined by their effectiveness. The Sky Raider was both, a technological anachronism that proved more effective than the advanced aircraft that were supposed to replace it. In the skies over Vietnam, the propeller had its last great triumph. Sergeant First Class Robert Jackson had been in tunnels before. In training at Fort Bragg, the instructors had built mock tunnel complexes to prepare soldiers for what they might encounter in Vietnam. Those exercises had been uncomfortable, claustrophobic, and deliberately stressful. They had not even come close to preparing him for the reality of Cu Chi. The tunnel complex beneath Cu Chi District extended for over 200 kilometers, a vast underground network that had been under construction since the 1940s. The Viet Minh had begun building it during their war against the French, and the Viet Cong had expanded it into one of the most impressive military engineering achievements in modern history. Multiple levels descended as deep as 10 meters into the earth. Living quarters, hospitals, storage facilities, and command centers were connected by passages so narrow that only the smallest soldiers could navigate them. Jackson was not a small man. At 5 feet 11 inches and 170 pounds, He was actually smaller than average for an American soldier, which was precisely why he had been selected for tunnel duty. The men who went into the tunnels, who became known as tunnel rats, needed to be small enough to fit through passages designed for Vietnamese bodies. They needed to be brave enough to crawl into darkness knowing that death could be waiting around every corner. And they needed to be armed with weapons that would work in the confined, desperate combat that tunnel warfare demanded. The standard issue weapon for American infantry in Vietnam was the M16 rifle, a revolutionary design that represented everything the military wanted its future weapons to be. Lightweight, high capacity, capable of automatic fire, the M16 was supposed to give American soldiers a decisive advantage over enemies armed with the heavier, less sophisticated AK-47. In the tunnels, the M16 was useless. Its length made it impossible to maneuver in tight spaces. Its muzzle flash and report in an enclosed environment would blind and deafen the shooter. Its tendency to jam when exposed to the dirt and moisture that permeated the tunnel environment made it unreliable precisely when reliability was a matter of life and death. The tunnel rats needed something else, and what they got was a weapon that their grandfathers would have recognized immediately. The M1911A1 pistol had been the standard sidearm of the United States military since 1911. Designed by John Moses Browning, the same genius who had created the M2 machine gun and the M1919, the 1911 was a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol that had been carried by American soldiers in 2 world wars, Korea, and countless smaller conflicts. It was heavy. It held only 7 rounds. Its recoil was substantial. By every metric that modern weapons designers use to evaluate firearms, it was obsolete. In the tunnels, it was perfect. Jackson remembered the weight of the 1911 in his hand as he descended into the darkness beneath Cu Chi for the first time. A flashlight in one hand, the pistol in the other, he crawled through passages so tight that his shoulders scraped both walls simultaneously. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. The silence was absolute except for the sound of his own breathing and the occasional drip of water from somewhere above. The first contact came without warning. A flicker of movement in the beam of his flashlight, a shape that resolved itself into a human figure approximately 10 feet ahead. Jackson fired twice before conscious thought caught up with his instincts, the .45 caliber rounds thundering in the confined space with a concussive force that seemed to shake the earth itself. The enemy soldier collapsed. Jackson's ears rang so loudly that he could barely hear himself think. But he was alive, and the 1911 had done exactly what it was designed to do. The .45 ACP cartridge that the 1911 fired was a man-stopper in the most literal sense. Developed in response to the Philippine-American War, where smaller caliber rounds had proven inadequate against determined enemies, the .45 ACP delivered massive energy transfer at close range. It did not merely wound, it incapacitated. In the tunnels, where engagement distances could be measured in feet rather than yards, that stopping power was the difference between survival and death. The 1911 also offered reliability that the M16 could not match. Its design was simpler, its tolerances more generous, its mechanism less susceptible to the dirt and moisture that destroyed more sophisticated weapons. Tunnel rats would emerge from hours underground, covered in mud and filth, their 1911s still functioning perfectly. The same could not be said for the M16s carried by soldiers who had merely walked through the jungle above. Jackson served 3 tours in Vietnam, volunteering for tunnel duty each time despite the extraordinary risks. He estimated that he entered enemy tunnel complexes over 200 times, engaging in close-quarters combat on at least 30 occasions. His 1911 never failed him. Not once in 3 years of the most demanding combat conditions imaginable did the weapon malfunction in any way. He was not unique in this experience. Tunnel rats throughout Vietnam developed an almost religious devotion to the 1911, refusing newer weapons that were offered as replacements. The Browning High Power, with its higher capacity magazine, was rejected because its 9mm rounds lacked stopping power. Various revolvers were tested and found wanting because their cylinders were too wide for the tightest passages. Only the 1911 combined the stopping power, reliability, and compact dimensions that tunnel warfare demanded. The weapon that emerged from those tunnels was often unrecognizable. Finishes were worn away. Grips were replaced with tape for better purchase in sweaty hands. Sights were filed down to prevent snagging on roots and debris. But the essential mechanism, John Moses Browning's masterpiece of firearms engineering, remained unchanged from the design he had perfected in 1911. Jackson retired from the Army in 1975, one of the last tunnel rats to serve in Vietnam. He kept his 1911 throughout his civilian life, maintaining it with the same care he had learned in those underground passages beneath Cu Chi. When he died in 2019, at the age of 78, the pistol was passed to his grandson along with a simple instruction: never let it go. This weapon saved my life more times than I can count. The grandson, a Marine Corps officer, carried that same 1911 into Afghanistan in 2021. The weapon that had been designed to fight in the trenches of the First World War, that had stormed the beaches of Normandy and the islands of the Pacific, that had crawled through the tunnels of Cu Chi, was still serving, still protecting, still proving that some designs are eternal. The war in Vietnam ended on April 30th, 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. For the United States, it was a defeat that would reshape foreign policy, military doctrine, and national identity for generations. For the weapons that had fought that war, it was merely a pause before the next conflict. The M2 Browning machine gun that had saved Private David Hendricks in the Ia Drang Valley continued serving. It was mounted on vehicles during Operation Desert Storm, its 50 caliber rounds proving as effective against Iraqi positions as they had against German fortifications 50 years earlier. It accompanied American forces into Afghanistan and Iraq, where new generations of soldiers discovered the same truth that their grandfathers had known. When you need a weapon that will work every single time, that will deliver devastating firepower under any conditions, that will keep you alive when everything else fails, the M2 delivers. As of 2024, the M2 remains in active service with the United States military. It has been continuously manufactured for over a century, making it the longest-serving weapon in American military history. The design has been updated and modernized, but the fundamental mechanism remains exactly what John Moses Browning created in 1918. Some weapons are simply too good to replace. The B-52 Stratofortress that rained destruction on the jungles of Vietnam continued its reign as the backbone of American strategic air power. It flew missions over Iraq in 1991, over Afghanistan in 2001, over Syria and Iraq in the campaign against ISIS. The aircraft that had been designed to deliver nuclear weapons to Soviet cities proved equally capable of delivering precision-guided munitions to terrorist compounds. The youngest B-52 currently in service was built in 1962. It is older than the parents of most of the crew members who fly it. Yet it remains one of the most capable bomber aircraft in the world, scheduled to continue serving until at least 2050. By then, the B-52 will have been in continuous service for nearly a century, a testament to the vision of the engineers who designed it and the adaptability of the platform they created. The M1919 machine gun that Petty Officer William Patterson used to save PBR 721 has been retired from American service, but its descendants continue. The M240 medium machine gun that replaced it incorporates many of the same design principles that made the M1919 so reliable. And in armories around the world, in the hands of allies and partners who received American weapons during the Cold War, the M1919 itself continues to serve. The A-1 Sky Raider that Lieutenant Commander James Morrison flew through walls of enemy fire has been retired for decades. But the lessons it taught about close air support, about the value of loiter time and payload capacity over raw speed, continue to influence aircraft design. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the legendary Warthog that has become the defining close air support platform of the modern era, owes much of its design philosophy to the Sky Raider that came before it, and the M1911 pistol that Sergeant First Class Robert Jackson carried into the tunnels of Cu Chi remains the standard against which all combat pistols are judged. The military officially replaced it with the Beretta M9 in 1985, citing the need for higher capacity and NATO standardization. But special operations units continued using the 1911, recognizing that no other pistol could match its combination of stopping power and reliability. In 2016, the Marine Corps began issuing the M45A1, a modernized version of the 1911, to its Special Operations Forces. The weapon that John Moses Browning designed in 1911 had come full circle. The story of these weapons is ultimately a story about what endures. In a world obsessed with progress, with innovation, with the newest and most advanced technology, the weapons of the Second World War remind us that some things cannot be improved upon. They were designed by engineers who understood that combat is chaos, that conditions are always worse than expected, that complexity is the enemy of reliability. They were tested in the most demanding circumstances imaginable and refined through years of continuous warfare. What emerged from that crucible was a generation of weapons so effective, so reliable, so thoroughly proven, that they remained relevant across decades of technological change. The soldiers who carried these weapons into Vietnam were fighting a new kind of war with old tools. They were told that jet aircraft and guided missiles and electronic surveillance would deliver victory. What actually delivered victory in the moments that mattered most was the M2 Browning that cleared an ambush, the B-52 that erased an enemy staging area, the M1919 that never jammed, the Sky Raider that stayed on station when jets had to leave, the 1911 that worked when nothing else would. Those soldiers learned something that their fathers and grandfathers could have told them, something that military planners and defense contractors and politicians never quite understood. The newest weapon is not always the best weapon. The most expensive weapon is not always the most effective weapon. And when your life depends on a piece of steel and engineering, you want the piece of steel and engineering that has already saved 1 million lives before yours. The weapons of the Second World War returned to Vietnam because they worked. They continued serving in conflicts around the world because they kept working. And they will continue serving in one form or another for as long as nations send their young men and women into harm's way. Some weapons are bound by time. Others transcend it. The weapons that returned to Vietnam belong to the second category, eternal instruments of destruction that proved themselves across generations of conflict. They are reminders that war, for all its technological change, remains fundamentally the same. Chaos, fear, the desperate need for tools that will not fail. In that need, the weapons of the past find their purpose. And in their continued service, we find the truth that binds all warriors across time. The weapon in your hands is the weapon that keeps you alive. Everything else is just history. If you watched until here, it's because this story truly resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can meet you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. And if these tales of weapons that transcended time inspired you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand that true effectiveness never expires. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story where history comes alive and reveals the lessons that textbooks forgot to teach. Until next time, remember, the past is never as distant as it seems. The weapons that saved our grandfathers are still saving lives today, and the stories they carried deserve to be told.